Amidst the sparkling lights of New York, a fateful encounter changed the lives of a young billionaire and a poor little girl forever. Do you think love can appear anywhere? Can a stranger become family? In this story, Marco Mastel, a lonely billionaire, meets Nice, a flower-selling girl on a cold winter street. From a small but heartfelt gesture, they create a new family where there is no wealth or fame, only love and sharing. But can a rich man learn the lesson of family from a homeless little girl? Come explore this touching journey in today's video. Snow began to fall on Fifth Avenue. Not the heavy flakes of an impending storm, but tiny sparkling specks, like diamond dust covering New York City in a fairy tale beauty. The Christmas lights from luxurious shops and towering buildings shone onto the street, creating a glittering golden carpet on the wet pavement. The honking of cars mixed with Christmas music from shop speakers, composing the noisy, familiar symphony of a winter night. Marco Mastel stood in the middle of that symphony, yet he could not feel a single sound. He was at a lavish charity gala on the rooftop of a five-star hotel. Crystal lights shimmered, wine glasses clinked, and the crisp laughter of people in expensive suits and magnificent evening gowns filled the air. Marco was the host of the party, a young billionaire, a rising star in the financial world. At 30, he had it all: power, fame, money. But standing among these people, he felt like nothing more than a hollow shell. His father, Edward Mastel, who had taught him to conquer this world with a steely mind and ruthless logic, stood nearby, looking at him with eyes full of pride. "You did very well, Marco," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "This event will bring a significant amount of money to our foundation." Marco nodded, flashing a professional smile. Edward had always seen success as the only measure of a person's life. He had turned Marco into a money-making machine, a perfect version of himself, but had unintentionally neglected the feelings and desires of a child. Marco's loneliness was not the loneliness of someone with no one beside them, but the loneliness of someone stripped of emotion. He left the conversation and walked toward the balcony where the snow was falling. He looked down at the city. The traffic, the rushing people, all were in a race against time. But just below, in a hidden corner on Fifth Avenue, another world existed. It was Nice's world. The little girl was only 4 years old, yet her eyes held the profound sadness of an old soul. Her worn red coat, missing a few buttons, was not enough to protect her small frame from the bitter cold. Her hands, unprotected by any gloves, clutched a wicker basket of flowers. The wild daisies and small violets tied with a thin string were perhaps all she had. Nice did not shout to beckon customers. Her voice was just a weak whisper, easily swallowed by the city's noise. "Flowers? Would you like to buy some flowers?" No one stopped. No one turned to look. The passers-by in their luxurious coats and with their designer bags hurried away from the girl as if poverty were a contagious disease. They would only glance at her, their eyes filled with pity or complete indifference. Nice was used to it. She moved along the pavement with the resilience of an invisible soul, one of the people this city devours and then pretends never existed. Occasionally she would stop, blow on her reddened hands, trying to warm them before continuing her hopeless journey. The lights from the shop windows reflected on Nice's thin face, highlighting her pale skin and chapped lips from the cold wind. Her blue eyes were still sharp, darting from side to side, searching for a glimmer of hope. Just one flower. If just one flower was sold, she would have a little warm food tonight. She held those flowers as if they were a rare treasure. They were not magnificent blooms, but to Nice, they were her entire fortune. She continued her walk, caught between the brilliant light and lonely darkness. No matter how cold the world outside was, she still believed in a small miracle, a rare moment of kindness. And that miracle came in the most unexpected way, brought by a man who was also lost in his own world. Marco returned inside, but his mind was no longer at the party. His gaze unintentionally swept across the large window pane, and then he saw the little girl. Tiny alone, a faint red spot in a sea of people. He witnessed it all, the indifferent stares of passers-by, and then the cruelty of a group of men. He saw one man wrapped in an expensive cloak and reeking of wine crush a flower in Nice's hand, laughing and spewing insults. A strange feeling rose in Marco's chest, not pity, but a simmering indignation. He saw the cowardice of the powerful bullying a child, and he saw his own loneliness reflected in her eyes. He abruptly left the party, walking quickly down the stairs, leaving the noisy sounds and respectful greetings behind. He had to do something immediately. When Marco neared, the group of men was still surrounding Nice. Their laughter echoed on the street. "Look here, friends," a tall man said, his voice full of contempt. "We have a tiny vendor here." He bent down, his breath heavy with the stench of alcohol. "Are these flowers so ugly that someone paid you to take them away?" The others laughed loudly, forming a closed circle. Nice backed away, her back against the cold wall of a building. She was cornered, her eyes filled with panic. Marco strode toward them, his voice calm, but containing a deadly coldness. $50 for all the flowers." The four men simultaneously turned. Their gazes shifted from mockery to confusion. The tall man looked Marco up and down, sizing up his clothes and his composure. "What?" he asked, clearly annoyed at the interruption to their fun. Marco took 2 steps, closing the distance. His eyes held no anger, only a chilling, sharp indifference that instinctively made the men step back. "I said $50 for all the flowers," he repeated, his voice still calm but now laced with authority. Then he turned to Nice. His eyes immediately softened. "Is that okay with you, little girl?" "Nice?" Her eyes, still teary, nodded silently. She couldn't believe what was happening. Marco took his wallet from his coat's inner pocket, pulled out a $50 bill, and handed it to Nice. She took it with trembling fingers, as if she didn't dare believe the bill was real. "You should be ashamed of yourselves," Marco said, turning back to face the men. His voice held no anger, just a simple observation, yet it carried an astonishing weight. 4 grown men surrounding a child. Is that what you call a joke? One of them was about to retort, but Marco didn't give them a chance. What kind of man feels better by making a child cry? Where is your courage? He shook his head as if looking at a disappointing riddle. Look at yourselves. The expensive suits, the fancy watches, stepping out of a restaurant where you probably spent more money than this little girl sees in a month. And you still need to put a child down to feel superior. Silence hung in the air. The 4 men looked uncomfortable, avoiding the eyes of Marco and Nice. A few passers-by slowed down, curious about the scene unfolding. "We were just kidding," the man with glasses stammered, adjusting his tie as if it had suddenly become too tight. "Yeah, just a joke," the man with the wine-red face added, already starting to retreat. "We didn't mean to hurt anyone." "A joke," Marco repeated, raising an eyebrow. "How interesting. But to her it doesn't seem very funny, does it?" He gestured toward Nice, who was still leaning against the wall, clutching her empty basket to her chest like a shield. "Hey, we don't need this," the tall man said, his voice annoyed but also anxious. "Let's go, guys." They began to walk away, mumbling to one another. Marco waited until they were out of sight, then turned his full attention to Nice. He knelt down to her eye level, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Nice nodded, still clutching the $50 bill as if it were a dream. Her blue eyes studied Marco, full of caution, but also a hint of hesitant gratitude. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice almost inaudible. "No need to thank me," Marco replied with a gentle smile. "Actually, I should be thanking you. I've been looking for flowers all day, but couldn't find any as beautiful as yours." A small smile appeared on Nice's face, brief but genuine, before it disappeared behind the watchful shell she had learned to wear on the streets. "It's very cold out here," Marco remarked, seeing her still tremble. "There's a coffee shop on the corner. Would you like a hot chocolate before you go home? They have the best marshmallows in the city." She hesitated, looking straight into Marco's eyes, searching for any sign of danger or deceit. Life on the streets had taught Nice that kindness rarely comes without a price. But there was something in this stranger's eyes, a simple sincerity, a genuine compassion that made her nod shyly. "I like hot chocolate," she said, her voice soft, but a little steadier. The small cafe on the corner was warm and inviting. The amber light cast a shimmering glow on the dark wooden tables. The scents of cinnamon and chocolate blended with the aroma of freshly ground coffee, creating a familiar and comforting atmosphere. Stepping inside, Nice felt the warmth envelop her, making her realize just how cold she had been. Marco chose a table near the window where they could see the snowflakes still falling. He gently helped Nice off with her damp coat, hanging it carefully on the back of the chair next to his own expensive overcoat. He ordered 2 hot chocolates with marshmallows as he had promised. A shy smile appeared on Nice's face as she noticed this small act of consideration. "So you like flowers, Nice?" Marco began the conversation. "Yes," Nice replied, her voice tiny. "I like daisies the most. They're very strong. They can grow anywhere." There was something touching in the way she spoke, as if she wasn't just describing the flowers, but also herself, a small survivor blooming in conditions where most would wither. When their drinks arrived, Nice held the cup with both hands as if to absorb every bit of warmth. She blew on it gently and took a small sip, her eyes widening in surprise. "Is it good?" Marco asked. Nice nodded, taking another sip. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was the silence of 2 people who didn't need to fill every moment with words, but rather the silence of mutual acceptance. Marco watched her as she drank, noticing details he hadn't seen on the street. A small tear in her sleeve sewn with a different colored thread, a makeshift bandage on her index finger, and the way her eyes constantly darted toward the door, a survival habit hard to break. Those eyes seemed far older than her 4 years. "Do you sell flowers every day?" he asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Nice hesitated, as if weighing how much to share with this stranger. "When it's not too cold," she answered, "or rainy. People don't buy flowers when it rains." "And why do you sell flowers?" he asked gently. Nice stirred her spoon in the cup, creating small swirls. "To buy food," she finally said, her voice small and matter-of-fact. "And sometimes to have a warm place to sleep when it's too cold." Something tightened in Marco's chest, a mix of compassion and admiration for the courage of a tiny child facing a world too large. They finished their hot chocolates in silence. Marco wanted to ask more where she lived if someone took care of her. But there was something in Nice's caution, a boundary she maintained, that he respected. "Thank you for the hot chocolate, sir," Nice said, folding the napkin neatly beside her empty cup. "And for the flowers." "It was a pleasure meeting you, Nice," he said. Nice nodded, then stood up the empty basket in her hand. She put her worn coat back on, adjusted her gray hat, and walked out the door, disappearing into the night. Marco sat there, the empty cup in his hand. Something had changed inside him. The image of the little girl selling flowers in the cold, all alone in an indifferent world, was etched into his mind. On his way home, he couldn't stop thinking about her, about the blue eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world, about the small hands that should have been playing with toys instead of tying flowers to sell, about the tiny voice so full of a terrifying maturity. When he entered his quiet, empty apartment, Marco realized that the hollowness he had felt for years seemed different, sharper, more painful. A little flower girl had changed something in him without even trying. The question now swirling in his mind was what he would do with that change. 3 weeks passed since that night on Fifth Avenue. Winter had tightened its icy grip on the city. Marco thought about Nice every day. In the most unexpected moments, the image of the girl with her flower basket would pop into his head. During important meetings, while driving home, even while preparing breakfast alone, he wondered where she was, if she was okay, if she had enough to eat. He had returned to Fifth Avenue several times at the same time, hoping to find her again. But Nice had vanished like a small ghost of the city, swallowed by the thousands of stories the city hides in its streets. One Saturday morning, the sky was clear and blue, but the cold was still biting. Marco decided to take a walk in Madison Square Park for no particular reason other than to escape the four walls of his apartment. The park was almost empty at that hour. Few people dared to go out in such low temperatures. And then he saw the little girl. Niece was squatting near a flower bed, digging in the snow with her bare fingers looking for something. Her red coat seemed more faded under the morning sun, and her gray hat had slipped down a little, revealing her messy brown hair. Marco froze as if he had hit an invisible wall. For a moment, he just stood there and watched her, noticing how her fingers were red from the cold, how she would occasionally blow on them to warm them up before continuing to dig in the snow. He approached slowly, not wanting to startle her. "Hello, niece," he said softly when he was a few steps away. The little girl looked up, her blue eyes wide with caution. For a second she seemed ready to run. Then a spark of recognition flashed on her face. "Mr. Marco," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Marco felt a wave of relief at being recognized. "You remembered my name." "You remembered my name too," she responded simply, as if that explained everything. "What are you looking for?" Marco asked, pointing to the small hole she had dug. Niece hesitated, as if weighing whether to share her secret. "Winter flowers," she finally said. "Sometimes they grow under the snow. They're very rare and very strong." Marco felt something tighten in his chest. The image of a small child digging in the snow for rare flowers with her red fingers seemed to hold a strange symbolic meaning. "Can I help?" he offered, kneeling down beside her, not caring that the snow was soaking into his pants. Niece shrugged, but moved over, making room for him. They dug in silence for a few minutes. Marco noticed that her hands weren't just red, but full of small cuts and calluses, hands that had worked more than they should have at her age. "Aren't you selling flowers today?" he asked casually. "Too cold," Niece replied without looking up. "People stay inside when it's like this, and the flowers die quickly too." She said it without self-pity, just a factual observation about the world around her. "I was hoping to find you again," Marco said after a moment of silence. "I came back to that spot a few times." Niece looked at him, her blue eyes examining his face as if searching for something. "Why?" she finally asked. The question caught Marco by surprise. How could he explain to a stranger, let alone a child, that a brief encounter had left such a profound mark? "I wanted to make sure you were okay," he answered honestly. Niece went back to digging in the snow, processing his answer. "I'm okay," she said, although the tremor in her red hands told a different story. Marco decided to change tactics. "Have you had breakfast?" The brief silence before she answered said it all. "Not yet." "I know a place nearby with amazing pancakes," Marco said, trying to keep his voice light. "I'm starving. Would you like to come with me?" Niece stopped digging. Her eyes met Marco's again, and he could see the internal battle between need and caution, between hunger and the street-smart suspicion she had learned. "Do they have real maple syrup?" she finally asked. Marco smiled. "The best in the city." She thought for a moment longer, then slowly nodded. "Okay." Maple Morning. Just 2 blocks from the park was a cozy diner with red leather booths and polished wooden tables. The smell of fresh coffee and grilling bacon filled the air, and the warmth inside was a welcome relief from the biting cold outside. They sat in a booth by the window. Niece looked both out of place and deeply curious, her eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail, assessing every person. When the pancakes arrived, Niece's eyes widened. A small pat of butter was slowly melting on top of each pancake, which was covered in a golden layer of maple syrup. "Looks delicious," Marco commented, picking up his fork. "Let's try them." The words seemed to break a spell. Niece picked up her fork with still red fingers and cut a small piece, almost afraid that the food would disappear if she were too greedy. When the first bite touched her tongue, her face changed. A genuine smile, the first one Marco had truly seen, radiated across her face, making her look exactly like a 4-year-old child. "Is it good?" Marco asked, although the answer was already obvious on her face. Niece nodded enthusiastically, cutting a slightly larger second piece. "Can I ask you something?" Marco said after a while. Niece looked at him, her eyes weary but curious. She nodded. "Where do you live?" She bent her head, staring at the table. "Different places," she finally answered. "Sometimes the shelter on 28th Street, but they don't let you stay during the day, just at night. And there are a lot of rules there." "And when you're not at the shelter, where do you stay?" Marco asked gently. Niece shrugged. "I find places. There's a spot behind a laundromat that's warm because of the machines, and the library lets me stay inside when it's too cold if I'm quiet." She said this as if it were completely normal for a 4-year-old to navigate the city's survival system on her own. "And your parents—" Marco hesitated, not wanting to push but needing to understand. Something shifted on Niece's face. A shadow passed over her blue eyes, a hardening of her lips. "My mom's gone," she said simply. "She got really sick and then went to heaven. That's what a lady at the shelter told me." Marco's heart ached. "I'm sorry, Niece." "It's okay," she replied with a sense of resignation. "It's been almost a year." "And your dad?" Marco asked, although he already guessed the answer. "I never met him," Niece said with no emotion. "It was just me and my mom, and now it's just me." The words, simple and brutal in their naked truth, hung between them. "I should go back to the park," Niece said, looking outside. "Can I come with you?" Marco asked. "I want to see if we can find those winter flowers." Niece looked at him for a moment as if to gauge his sincerity. "If you want to," she finally said. "But it's boring. Just digging in the snow." "I don't think it will be boring," Marco replied genuinely. And so a routine began, and in the following weeks it became the center of Marco's life. Every day he met Niece at Madison Square Park. On weekdays it was late in the afternoon after he got off work. On weekends they met in the morning and spent hours together. They always started with a meal. Marco noticed Niece gradually eating more color, slowly returning to her cheeks, and her eyes becoming brighter. In the park, he accompanied her on her expeditions. They searched for flowers hidden under the snow-watched birds and fed squirrels. Niece knew every nook and cranny of the park, every secret hiding spot, every place where the urban wildlife gathered. Marco discovered that she had never been to school. Her mother had taught her the basics. She could read a little, knew some numbers, but her most impressive knowledge was about nature. She identified birds by their songs, knew the habits of the small animals in the park, and recognized which plants could survive the harsh winter. "How do you know all this?" Marco asked one day as they watched a brilliant red cardinal perched against the white snow. "By watching," Niece answered simply. "And my mom showed me. She said, 'The city has green secrets. Most people don't see them.'" Marco liked the phrase, and she was right. He had lived in this city for years and had never noticed half the things Niece pointed out: the resilient buds sprouting from cracks in the sidewalk, the bird nests hidden in seemingly barren trees, the life that still thrummed even on the coldest, grayest days. As the days passed, Marco began to reorganize his life around these meetings. He left work earlier, delegating tasks he used to do himself, and turning down evening appointments that interfered with his park time. His boss noticed the change. "Everything okay, Mastel? You used to be the last one to leave." "Never better," Marco replied. And he knew it was true. He started bringing books to read with Niece, sitting on a park bench, stories about children and animals, about adventures in magical forests. At first he read to her. Then he began to teach her to read better, helping her spell difficult words, praising her progress. There were days when Niece didn't show up. On those days, Marco felt an inexplicable emptiness, a gnawing anxiety. He would search for her in the park, walk along the nearby streets, even pass by the shelter she had mentioned. Then the next day she would reappear as if nothing had happened, and the relief Marco felt was almost overwhelming. As the sun began to set on a Friday afternoon, Marco looked at his watch. "It's getting late," he said. Niece glanced at the sky. Yeah, she agreed. The birds are going back to their nests. Where will you go now? He asked, although he already knew the answer. The shelter, she replied. Fridays usually aren't too crowded. Niece, he said, kneeling down to her level. I've been thinking. The forecast says there's going to be a big snowstorm tomorrow, maybe the worst of the winter. She nodded. The squirrels are collecting extra nuts. They always know when a big snow is coming. Marco smiled at the observation, then became serious again. Do you have somewhere to stay if the shelter is too full? Niece shrugged. I'll find a place. I always do. Tomorrow, he said, his voice firm. If the storm is as bad as they say, I want you to consider an offer. I have a large apartment with a bedroom no one uses. It's warm and safe. You could stay there until the storm passes. Niece's eyes widened in surprise. She stared at Marco's face, searching for any sign of deceit. You'll take me to your home? She asked, as if the idea were completely alien. Yes, Marco confirmed. If you want to. No pressure, it's just an option if you need a safe place. Niece thought about the offer, her small face serious and pensive. Finally, she nodded slowly. I'll think about it, she said, her voice small but determined. Great, Marco replied. We'll meet here at noon tomorrow. Noon tomorrow, Niece confirmed. They said their goodbyes at the park entrance. Niece went in one direction toward the shelter, and Marco went in another toward his empty apartment. He watched her small figure walk away, her faded red coat against the white snow, until she turned a corner and disappeared from sight. As he walked home, Marco felt a mix of hope and anxiety. Maybe tomorrow he could give Niece a true shelter from the storm. In the following days, Marco's life changed dramatically. Each morning, he no longer woke up to the feeling of emptiness or the coldness of an overly large apartment. He had a new purpose. He prepared breakfast for two, setting the table with care, making sure Niece had a nutritious meal. Her innocent laughter as she played with her new teddy bears, her whispered conversations with her toys, all brought life to his vast, soulless apartment. It was no longer just a place to sleep. It had become a home. Marco quickly arranged for Niece to attend school. He took her to a nearby preschool. Niece was a fast learner, craving knowledge like a sponge absorbing water. She quickly made friends, and Marco felt a warm sense of pride in his chest as he watched her integrate into the world. He also felt a simmering fear, afraid that this was all too good to be true. He was scared that at any moment someone would come and claim Niece, taking away the light he had found by chance. He had begun the legal process to adopt her, but he knew the process would be complicated and take time. However, Marco's life was not entirely his own anymore. His work at the company was entering a crucial phase. He was negotiating a multi-billion-dollar merger, the most important project of his career. Late nights at the office and sudden business trips became more frequent. He had to hire a babysitter, an older woman named Sarah, to look after Niece. At first, Niece did not like the idea. She seemed anxious when Marco wasn't home. He tried to comfort her, promising to return as soon as possible, but he knew that promise was often broken. He realized that he had become too accustomed to putting work first. Edward Mastel had taught him that nothing was more important than one's career. Now, Marco had to struggle with himself with what had been ingrained in him for 30 years. One evening, Marco came home after 11 p.m. exhausted and with a heavy mind. The apartment was silent, with only the soft glow of a nightlight in the living room. Sarah had already left. He tiptoed into Niece's room. She was asleep, curled up under her blanket, clutching a teddy bear he had bought for her. Marco felt a deep sense of shame. He had promised, but he couldn't keep his word. And he felt the fragility of everything. The fragility of this home built on a foundation of trust that he had himself shaken. The little girl needed his presence, not money or a babysitter. He understood that a child's stability could not be bought with material things. On Saturday morning, Marco woke up with a heavy heart. He went to Niece's room to wake her for breakfast, but she wasn't there. The bed was empty. He called her name. There was no answer. He frantically ran through the apartment, his heart pounding. Finally, he entered his own room and saw that the balcony door was ajar. Inside the room, her old wicker basket, her worn coat, and her knit hat were all gone. Niece had run away. A cold wave washed over Marco, a feeling colder than the blizzard outside. He knew he had made a mistake. He had focused too much on his work and neglected Niece, the person he felt closest to and knew needed protection. He quickly put on his coat, not bothering with gloves, and ran outside down the street. It was still bitterly cold. He looked for her everywhere, in the park, on the street corner, in the places she had told him about. He called her name, his voice filled with despair. "Niece, Niece, it's me." Finally he found her. Not somewhere far away, but exactly where they had first met, on the corner of Fifth Avenue. She was huddled against the old wall, the basket without flowers, her eyes filled with tears. Marco sighed in relief, but it was immediately followed by a pang of pain upon seeing her in that state. He sat down beside her, trying not to scare her. "Niece," he said softly, "why are you here?" She didn't answer, just cried. Tears glistened on her reddened cheeks. "I don't want to be a burden," she finally said, her voice trembling. "You're so busy. I can't stay in your house anymore. I can't have a home. I can only be a street kid. I have to do the job of a street kid." Those words hit Marco's heart like a punch. He hugged her, holding her carefully but tightly. "No, Niece," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You are not a burden. You have never been a burden. You are the best thing that has ever happened to me. I was a lonely man before I met you. I had everything, but I had nothing. I had no one. And then you came and brought light into my life. I just didn't know how to keep it. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for making you feel this way. Don't ever leave again. Never." Marco realized that he had been too focused on making money, on building a career, and had forgotten the core of happiness. He had found a gem in the garbage, and he had almost let it slip through his fingers. He had learned his first and most painful lesson about love and responsibility. "You have to trust me," he said, his voice pleading. "Please trust me. I will never leave you alone again. We'll figure everything out together. I promise. I will be your family. Not a temporary one, but a permanent family." He hugged her tighter, feeling the trust returning in her small body. Niece nodded, burrowing into his embrace. In the bitter cold of a New York winter, Marco had found the meaning of life. After that night on the street corner, Marco took Niece back home. The atmosphere in his apartment was no longer just the warmth of the heater, but also the warmth of a promise. He spent the entire weekend by her side to prove that he would never leave her alone again. Niece, with the sensitivity of a child who had lived in fear, gradually began to trust again. The constant wariness in her eyes was replaced by peace and confidence. But Marco knew that love alone was not enough. He needed a more solid foundation. He could not continue this ambiguous life, where Niece could be taken away at any time. He decided to begin the legal adoption process. He sought out a lawyer specializing in family law, Thomas Bennett, who had once worked for his father's company. The first meeting took place at the lawyer's office, a serious-looking place with towering stacks of files and the smell of old paper. Marco told his story as truthfully as he could, from the fateful night they met to the following months. Thomas listened carefully, his face emotionless, but Marco sensed the empathy hidden beneath his professional demeanor. "This is a special case, Marco," Thomas said, closing the file. "A single, unrelated man adopting a child. We will face many legal hurdles and a lot of social scrutiny. Most importantly, we need approval from the child services." Soon after, Marco and Niece's lives came under scrutiny. A social worker named Elaine was assigned to investigate their case. Elaine was unlike the friendly people Niece had met at school or the coffee shop. She wore a starched navy blue jacket, had her hair in a neat bun, and her eyes were sharp, missing no detail. She came to their home meticulously interviewing Marco about his work history, financial situation, and daily habits. Nice, with her deep-seated survival instincts, immediately sensed the tension. She was no longer as comfortable as before. Whenever Elaine appeared, Nice became quiet, hiding behind Marco or retreating to her room. She was afraid of the questions Elaine asked, questions about her mother, about her days on the streets, about how she felt living with a stranger. "She seems scared," Elaine remarked bluntly after one interview. "That shows her bond with you isn't strong enough. She still doesn't truly trust this stability." Elaine's words were a punch to Marco's chest. He understood her caution, but he also felt helpless. He knew Nice loved him, and he loved her, but he couldn't explain those complex emotions to a person who only saw numbers in documents. One afternoon after Elaine had left, Nice had a change in mood. She wouldn't eat, just sat quietly staring into space. Marco tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't answer. He felt the fear rising in her. He realized that Nice wasn't afraid of life on the streets. She was afraid of being separated from him. She had built a home in her soul, and now she was scared it would be destroyed. "Nice," Marco said, kneeling to her eye level. "What's wrong, honey? You can talk to me." Nice looked at him, her eyes welling up with tears. "Ms. Elaine said they might find my relatives. They said I might have to go live with my family. They will take me away from you." Those words pierced Marco's heart. He understood her fear. It wasn't the fear of rejection, but the fear of being replaced. She was afraid that even after finding a place to belong, she would still be considered rootless and could be handed over to a stranger, someone with a blood connection, but no affection. "Nice," Marco said, his voice full of conviction. "Listen to me. I won't let that happen. I will fight for you." "But what if they find someone?" Nice asked, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I don't want to go." "I want to stay with you." Marco hugged Nice tightly, stroking her messy hair. He took a deep breath and said the words from the bottom of his heart. "I promise you. I don't know who they will find, but no matter who they find, I won't let them take you away. I will fight for you with all my strength, with everything I have. I will fight everyone, every rule, so you can stay with me. Because, Nice, you are my family. You are not just a child I'm adopting. You are my daughter, and a father will never let his daughter go." That promise was not an empty one. It was a vow. It dispelled all the fear in Nice's heart. She hugged Marco back tightly, feeling his strong heartbeat. She knew that this time the promise was real. There were no conditions, no strings attached, only love. And even if this world were to fall apart, that promise would remain eternal. Marco also felt a sense of relief. He had acknowledged his love for Nice not just to her, but to himself. He was no longer a lonely man who only knew work and money. He had found the meaning of life, and that meaning could not be measured by net worth or merger deals. It was measured by smiles, hugs, and promises kept. From that moment on, Marco entered the legal battle with a determined will. He worked with his lawyer, Thomas, gathering all the evidence from Nice's school reports to the testimonies of her babysitter and neighbors. He did everything to prove that he was a trustworthy father and that he could give Nice a stable and happy life. He knew this journey would be long and difficult, but he was no longer alone. He had Nice, and with her by his side, he had everything he needed to fight. The call from his father came on a Thursday morning. Edward Mastel's voice was as cold and decisive as ever. "Marco, I need to see you at my office immediately. Thomas Bennett called me. It seems we need to talk about what you're doing." Edward was a man who had built a financial empire from nothing. He believed in logic, in numbers, and in efficiency. In his eyes, every decision had to be carefully considered with no room for emotions. Marco knew that Edward had found out about his adoption of Nice. He knew this confrontation was inevitable. He was ready not with the fear of a son facing his strict father, but with the composure of a man who had found the meaning of his life. Edward's office was on the top floor of the Mastel Financial Tower. From the window, one could see a panoramic view of New York City, a symbol of power and success. Edward was standing there, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out at the city like a general surveying his battlefield. When Marco walked in, he did not turn around, only gesturing for him to sit down. "Thomas tells me you've started the process of adopting a child, a 4-year-old girl with no relatives whom you found on the street." Edward began, his voice calm but authoritative. "Do you know how this will affect your career? A single man in a position as important as yours taking on such a great responsibility. You won't have the time or the focus. This is an irrational decision, Marco." Edward finally turned, looking directly into his son's eyes. Marco did not flinch. He had once been afraid of that look, but now he only saw a familiar emptiness. "I've thought about all of that, Father," Marco replied calmly. "And I've made my decision." Edward raised an eyebrow. "A decision. A child. Marco, you have everything. A rising career, a brilliant future. Are you willing to throw it all away for a responsibility you've taken upon yourself?" "I'm not throwing it away, Father," Marco said, his voice firm. "I'm building something. You once told me when I was a boy that you worked hard to build something great, something that could last forever." Edward nodded, seeming surprised by Marco's change of topic. "That's right. A legacy. And so am I," Marco continued, looking his father in the eye. "But perhaps we have different definitions of legacy. My mother, she taught me about kindness, about love, and I believe that love is also something that can last forever." "Marco, you can't compare business with emotions," Edward said, seeming annoyed. "I'm not comparing, Father," Marco responded. "I'm just saying that for me, a legacy is not a multi-billion-dollar corporation. A legacy is a child. It's the ability to change a person's life. Niece taught me that." Marco took a deep breath. "You raised me alone after Mother passed. You did everything you could to give me the best life. But you were also very busy. You had to face the pain and responsibility alone. Do you remember you once said that you would build a world where I would never have to suffer as you did? But in the end, I still felt lonely. You gave me a comfortable life, but you couldn't give me a true home, a family. Now I have a chance to fix that, not just for Niece, but for myself as well." Marco's words struck Edward's heart directly. He had tried so hard to be a good father, but work had consumed all of his time and mind. He had built an empire, but had unintentionally left his only son to a life of loneliness. Edward looked at Marco, and for the first time in years he did not see a talented financial executive, but a 10-year-old boy who had lost his mother, a boy trying to find love. A long silence hung between the two men. Edward Mastel, the iron-willed man, finally yielded to the power of love. He looked out at the city, then turned back, his eyes softer. "Your mother, she would be proud of you," he said, his voice low and emotional. "She always had a kind heart." That was the greatest validation Marco had ever received from his father. The pain of the past, the distance of time, all seemed to be soothed in that moment. Edward reached out, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "If you've made your decision, then I will support you." "I'll help you," Edward said, returning to his usual professional demeanor. "We will rearrange your schedule. I will transfer some projects to others so you have more time. And I want to meet the little girl. Your mother would have loved her." Marco felt a great joy. He had not only fought for Niece, but also for himself, for the father-son relationship that had been damaged for so long. "She will be very happy to meet you, Father," Marco said, his voice choked with emotion. "Thank you." Leaving Edward's office, Marco felt a great sense of relief. He knew the road ahead was still full of challenges, but now he was no longer alone. He had Niece, and he had his father's support. Two lonely hearts had found each other, and in the journey of building a new home, they had unintentionally mended a relationship that had seemed broken beyond repair. After his meeting with his father, Marco dedicated all his energy to completing the adoption paperwork. He worked closely with his lawyer, Thomas Bennett, gathering all the necessary evidence to prove he was a fit parent and that Niece was living a stable, happy life. Marco wanted everything to be done perfectly, leaving no loopholes that could jeopardize the small family he had worked so hard to build. One morning, Marco had an important appointment with Thomas to review the final documents before filing them with the court. Niece, with the sensitivity of a child who had been through too much, asked to come along. She didn't want to be left alone with the babysitter. Marco understood her fear, the fear that everything could disappear at any moment, and he agreed. The lawyer's office was on the 20th floor of a skyscraper with a panoramic view of New York City. The atmosphere was formal and quiet. Marco and Thomas sat in a small conference room while Niece was arranged on a chair in the hallway outside. Marco gave her a coloring book and a box of crayons, and Niece sat obediently, her small feet dangling in the air. The conference room door was closed, but a slight crack remained, allowing sounds to escape. Niece wasn't really focused on the book. Her small ears were listening intently. She heard Marco's warm voice, Thomas's calm tone, and the dry rustling of papers. She didn't understand all the legal terms, but she understood the meaning behind the words. "Everything looks good, Marco," Thomas said. "Elaine's report was excellent. Niece has fully adapted to her new life, has good academic standing, and most importantly, her bond with you has been confirmed. We have enough evidence to file the formal adoption petition immediately." Marco breathed a sigh of relief. "So we have a strong chance then, Thomas?" "Yes," Thomas replied. "My firm believes this will be a successful case. Niece's lack of relatives, your financial stability, and the clear bond between you two will be the deciding factors. There's only one thing left to consider." Niece, sitting outside, gripped the crayon box tightly in her hands. She held her breath. What was the one thing to consider? Was it something about her? Would they say she wasn't worthy? Thomas continued. "Once the adoption is finalized, should we change her last name? It's quite common in these cases." "Last name?" Marco repeated, his voice filled with surprise. He had never thought of this. He had been so focused on having Niece in his life that he had forgotten about this small but incredibly meaningful detail. "Mastel," he said, as if tasting the sound of it. A gentle smile appeared on his face. "Niece Mastel. It sounds perfect." "So you want to add that to the petition?" Thomas asked. "Yes, I do," Marco replied, his voice full of conviction. "And if she wants to, of course." Niece, sitting outside, felt a jolt run down her spine. Niece Mastel. A last name. A name that truly belonged to someone. No longer an empty name drifting on the streets. She had a last name. She had a family. Niece's eyes welled with tears. The fear that had once haunted her, the fear that she would never have a place to belong, that she was just a tiny grain of sand no one cared about, melted away. She had found her ocean. Thomas continued talking about legal procedures, but Niece no longer heard anything. She only heard one phrase, a phrase that had changed her whole life. "I want her to be my daughter, legally." 6 words. 6 simple words that shattered all the doubt, all the fear, all the insecurity in Niece's heart. She had lived a life full of broken promises of love that was taken away. But now there was a wealthy, powerful man who was ready to fight for her, not out of obligation, but out of love. He wanted her to be his daughter, not just an adopted child. Niece closed the coloring book. She felt a strange sense of courage. She was no longer afraid. She had a home, a father, and now she would have a last name. A last name that proved she was no longer a stranger in this world. When Marco and Thomas walked out of the conference room, they saw Niece sitting up straight in her chair, a radiant smile on her face. Her eyes were sparkling a light Marco had never seen in her before. He knew something had happened, but he didn't know what it was. "We're all done, Thomas," Marco said, kneeling to Niece's level. "Now we're going to get some ice cream. You can have as many flavors as you want." Niece didn't say anything, just nodded. She reached out, clasping Marco's hand tightly, a firm and trusting grip. Together, they walked away. Outside New York City was still loud and cold, but in Nice's heart, winter had ended. A new door had opened. The door to a real family. The final decision day arrived on a crisp, cold morning in December. Winter had painted the streets white, but in Marco's heart there was a strange warmth and excitement. This was the day that his and Nice's relationship would no longer be bound by chance or kindness, but would be etched forever on paper, legally recognized. This was the moment they would officially become a family. Marco wore a dark blue suit, perfectly pressed, and Nice wore a cream-colored wool dress he had bought for her. The dress was simple, but made her look like a little angel. Her hair was neatly combed, and her blue eyes no longer held the panic of her wandering days, but sparkled with anticipation. Edward Mastel, Marco's father, was also present. He wore a sturdy gray winter coat, standing steadfastly beside his son. His expression was still stern, but his eyes held a hint of tenderness and pride. Thomas Bennett, the lawyer who had been with them, was also there holding a thick folder, his face calm and confident. They arrived at the New York family court. The interior was not as glamorous as the skyscrapers where Marco usually worked. It had a solemn feel with long, silent corridors. Nice, visiting a place like this for the first time, held tightly to Marco's hand, her eyes wide as she observed everything. The courtroom was small and simple. The judge, an elderly woman with silver hair and thin-rimmed glasses, sat behind a dark wooden desk. She had a gentle demeanor but an authoritative voice. "We will proceed with the final hearing for the adoption case of Marco Mastel and Nice," she said, glancing through the file. "Mr. Mastel, are you prepared for this?" Marco took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I am ready. I have done and will do everything I can to care for Nice." The judge nodded, then looked at Nice, who was sitting quietly in the chair beside Marco. "Nice, do you know what we are doing?" she asked gently. Nice looked up at the judge, then at Marco. She nodded decisively. "Yes, I know. Mr. Marco will be my dad, and I will have a new name." Her voice was small but very clear. The judge smiled. She turned to Marco. "Do you wish to change Nice's last name?" "Yes, Your Honor," Marco replied, looking directly into Nice's eyes. "I would like her to have my last name, Nice Mastel." Edward Mastel stood tall, a slight smile on his lips. He had said nothing, but his presence was a silent agreement. The judge nodded. "Then, after reviewing all the evidence and testimony, the court has decided to approve this adoption. From this moment on, Marco Mastel will be the legal guardian of Nice, and Nice will officially bear the last name Mastel." The judge's words echoed in the quiet room like a verdict, but not a verdict of punishment, but of love. Nice couldn't hold back her emotions. Her eyes welled up. She looked up at Marco, and a tear rolled down her cheek. Marco, a man accustomed to controlling his emotions, also felt a lump in his throat. He knelt down, holding Nice tightly. She wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her head in his shoulder. "Dad," she whispered. Just one word. Just one simple word, but it melted Marco's heart. He had been waiting for this word unconsciously since the first night he met her on the street. He had been waiting for a home, a family, and now he had it all. Edward Mastel stepped forward, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "You've done a very good thing, Marco," he said, his voice no longer as cold as before. He looked at Nice, who was nestled in Marco's arms, and a warm smile appeared on his face. "Welcome to the family, Nice." Afterward, they left the courthouse together. The morning sun of New York shone upon the city, glistening against the white snow. Everything seemed to have changed. The air felt fresher, the honking of cars more melodic. "Where do we go now, Dad?" Nice asked, her voice full of joy. Marco smiled. "We're going home, my daughter. Home." The words were not just for Nice, but for Marco himself. He had once had a house, but he had never had a family, and now he had both. At the apartment, Marco had prepared a small party. Edward had sent someone to bring a large cake decorated with white daisies. Edward sat down with Niece, telling her about Marco's mother, about her love for wild daisies. Edward spoke of how she had taught Marco about kindness, and Marco realized that throughout all the years of hard work, his father had always remembered his mother's lessons. Marco's life had taken a new turn. He was still a billionaire, but he was no longer a hollow shell. He had found the meaning of his life not in the numbers on a stock exchange, but in the clear laughter of a child. Niece had not only gained a family but also helped him mend his relationship with his father and heal his own emotional wounds. The most sacred moment was not when the verdict was pronounced, not when the new name was etched, but when a lonely heart found a harbor and a house became a home. It was a story of salvation, not of the rich saving the poor, but of a child who used love to save a lost soul. After the day at the courthouse, life for Marco and Niece began a new chapter, free from temporary arrangements and anxieties. They had a name, a family, and a secure future. Marco had kept his promise. He had restructured his work, no longer staying late and adopting a more flexible schedule. His father, Edward, helped him adjust his projects so he could spend more time with Niece. Marco began picking Niece up from school every day. The moment she ran to him and hugged him, calling out "Dad," became his endless source of energy. That call was not just a name. It was a confirmation of love, a declaration from a heart that had found its harbor. Together they did simple, small things that Marco had never considered before. He taught Niece how to ride a bike in the park, baked crispy cookies with her on weekends, and read to her before bed. The fairy tales of princesses and princes seemed to come to life when told in a father's deep, warm voice. Niece also changed every day. The wariness in her eyes was gone, replaced by the trust and innocence of a true child. She started to laugh more, talk more, and share with Marco the small details from school, her new friends, and her innocent dreams. She told him about a boy named Liam at school who gave her a candy, about a teacher who praised her drawing, and about a stray cat she wanted to bring home. Each of Niece's stories was a piece of a puzzle filling the emptiness in Marco's heart. Edward Mastel, the man who always put work first, also began a new relationship with Niece. He visited his granddaughter every week. Niece was not afraid of him. She saw the deep-seated loneliness in the eyes of the powerful man. Niece told him about wild daisies and the birds she had learned about in the park. Edward, a man who had known only numbers and charts his entire life, listened to Niece intently. She had become the bridge between two generations, mending the father-son relationship that seemed to have been broken. One afternoon, Edward visited Niece. He sat on the sofa, and Niece sat beside him on the soft rug. She took out a photo album, pointing to a black-and-white picture of Marco's mother. "She looks so kind, doesn't she, Grandpa?" Niece asked. "Yes," Edward replied, his voice catching. "She was the kindest woman I ever knew." "My dad says she liked daisies just like me," Niece said, and Edward nodded. "She used to say that daisies are a symbol of sincerity." "So are you, Niece," Edward said, looking straight into her eyes for the first time with genuine affection. "You are also a symbol of sincerity." Marco stood at the door, quietly observing the scene. He realized that Niece had not only brought light into his life, but also into his father's. She had done what Marco had tried to do his whole life, mend his relationship with his father. Marco no longer had to search for happiness in multi-million-dollar contracts. He found happiness in family dinners, in laughter, in Niece's small stories. He had learned that love is not something that can be measured by money or fame, but something that can be felt with the heart. Niece, too. She no longer lived in the fear of uncertainty. She had a home, a father, and a grandfather who loved her. She had learned that love can be found in the most unexpected places, and that it can heal the deepest wounds. In Marco's apartment, there was no longer the coldness of sterile white walls. Niece's crayon drawings were taped to the refrigerator. Children's books were scattered on the floor. The apartment had become a true home, reflecting the love and vitality of a family. The relationship between Marco and Nice was proof that love does not need to be built on blood ties, but can be created through sincerity and compassion. They had found each other not by chance, but by an invisible thread that connected two lonely souls and created a forever family. In the end, Marco had everything he needed, not what he had once craved, but what he had never known he needed. He had found a home, a family, and an eternal love in the heart of a little flower girl. Spring arrived, bringing with it warmth and new life. The wild daisies, Nice's favorite flowers, began to bloom in the parks, pushing back the cold of winter. Marco's apartment was no longer just a place to live, but a true home. Nice's crayon drawings were taped all over the walls. Her children's books were on the shelves, and her clear laughter echoed through the rooms. Marco had learned to slow down. He no longer raced against time. Instead, he savored every moment with Nice. He gave up lavish parties and meaningless social gatherings so he could bake cookies with Nice read to her and explore the city's wonders. He realized that happiness wasn't found in the numbers in a bank account, but in the peace of his soul. Edward Mastel, Marco's father, also became a part of this small family. Edward had once been a cold and distant man, but Nice used her innocence and purity to melt his heart. Edward visited Nice, often bringing small gifts and listening to her stories about her world. He had begun to tell Nice about Marco's mother, about their beautiful memories, and Nice had become the bridge, mending the damaged relationship between the two generations. One day, when spring had fully arrived, Edward made a surprising offer. "Let's take a family photo," he said. "A real one, not for others to see, but to keep for ourselves." Marco agreed. He chose Madison Square Park as the location for the photo where everything had begun. The place where he had found Nice again, where he had seen her strength and resilience, and where he had made the promise to be by her side forever. They arrived at the park on a sunny afternoon. Nice wore a simple white dress, and her hair was neatly brushed by Marco. Edward wore a gray coat, standing solidly beside Marco. They didn't hire a professional photographer, but just asked a passerby to help. The photo wasn't perfect. The light wasn't the best, and the wind made Nice's hair fly a little, but it was the most genuine photo. The picture captured the moment when three people, three different destinies, had found each other and created a family. In the photo, Marco looked at Nice with eyes full of love and pride. Edward smiled a true, unforced smile, and Nice, with her bright blue eyes, stood between the two men, her smile as radiant as a wild daisy. The photo was later framed and placed on Marco's desk, facing the glass walls where he had once felt lost and lonely. Now, whenever he looked up, he saw the photo a reminder that he was no longer alone. He had a family. The relationship between Marco and Nice was not just a story of salvation. It was also a story of love, patience, and compassion. Marco had not only adopted a child, but also found the meaning of his life. Nice had not only gained a family, but also found a place to belong, a place to be loved and protected. On the last night of the story, Marco walked into Nice's room. She was fast asleep, clutching her old teddy bear tightly. Marco sat down by the bed, looking at her peaceful face. He stroked her hair and whispered, "I love you, Nice, and I promise to be here for you forever." Nice, although asleep, seemed to have heard his words. She smiled in her dream. The final family photo had been taken, but it wasn't an end. It was a beginning. The beginning of a new story, of an eternal love, of a family that was built not on blood but on promises kept and hearts that had been mended. From strangers to family, Marco and Nice's journey proves that love is the greatest wealth we can have. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring tales. Leave a comment below. What do you think is the true meaning of family? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for watching. And remember, sometimes the most unexpected connections can change our lives forever. See you in the next video.